Thank you all for coming today. It's nice to see a good-sized crowd for a Stony Brook event. Can you hear me? No? Can you hear me now? Yeah, okay, I'll bend over further. I'm Van McCrary in the Center for Medical Humanities, Compassionate Care, and Bioethics. We're now in the newly renamed Department of Family, Population, and Preventive Medicine. I think we're trying for the longest department name. So we've succeeded in that as far as I can tell. I'm very pleased to be introducing our speaker today. He is James H. Jones. Dr. Jones is an alumni distinguished professor emeritus at the University of Arkansas. He holds a PhD in American Social and Intellectual History from Indiana University. He's held in the past fellowships from NIMH, Harvard, the Kennedy Institute of Ethics at Georgetown University, the Rockefeller Foundation, and the National Endowment for the Humanities. So he's really been around. He's the author of two major books. The first is Bad Blood, which is the story of the Tuskegee Syphilis experiments that you're going to hear in this hour. And his other large book is Alfred C. Kinsey, A Private Public Life. Bad Blood won several awards after it was released, including one of the best 12 books of the year by the New York Times Book Review. His biography of Dr. Kinsey was one of two finalists for the 1997 Pulitzer Prize. And he's published in periodicals as widely diverse as the Hastings Center Report, which is a central bioethics publication, and the New Yorker magazine. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Jones.
Thank you, Dan. I'm supposed to be wired. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Wonderful. So, Van, thanks for that lovely introduction. Dr. Stephen Post, I know you're in the audience somewhere. There you are. Okay. Thanks, the two of you, for getting me here. It's my pleasure. When I talk about Tuskegee, I like to talk about how I got interested in the topic first. I was a graduate student at Indiana. I went to the National Archives to do archival research on what was the social hygiene movement in American society, the effort of reformers at the beginning of the, say 1900 to about 1920 to do something about prostitution and venereal disease. And I wanted to look at the social hygiene movement as kind of a backdrop to Alfred Kinsey, because it was the social hygienist who went a long way to shattering the conspiracy of silence about sexual matters, and so I thought that would be a good place to start for science and sex. When I went to the archives to research this topic, I worked in Record Group 90. And Record Group 90 houses the United States Public Health Service's Division of Venereal Disease Records. It's 420-something letter boxes. Everything in that collection spoke either to the prophylaxis of syphilis or the treatment of syphilis. Except, when I'm slugging through this stuff, I come across 4 boxes about this untreated syphilis program in Macon County, Alabama. And I remember, a dutiful graduate student that I was, I looked through those boxes carefully, and then I, went forward. That was in 1970. That was 2 years before the story broke in the press. If I'd been worth my salt, I would have put 2 and 2 together and understood that I was, sitting on something there that was awful and the public should have known something about. My only excuse is that I was, after all, in an archive. And maybe I'm to be forgiven for thinking that the mortmain of the past was there. But be that as it may, that's how I stumbled across stuff. Okay, fast forward to 1972. I've just finished my doctorate at Indiana. I've been named a Kennedy Fellow at Harvard. I'm going to the Interfaculty Program in Biomedical Ethics and the History of Medicine, Arthur Dyke and that group's program, Bill Kern. And I'm driving across country, and Gene Heller of the Associated Press breaks the story. It's in August of 1972. So when I get to Harvard, I go see Arthur Dyke, who was the chairman of the program that gave me the fellowship, And I said, you know, I know you gave me the fellowship for this, but I want to do that. I want to work on Tuskegee because I think I know where the records are. And it was clear to me in 5 seconds that he didn't care what I did as long as I got out of his office, you know. And that was an important lesson to learn because it's, you know, it kind of establishes reality in your mind that the relationship between a chaired professor at Harvard and a postdoc is roughly that between, you know, a dog and a hydrant. You know, you just sort of want to get out of the way, you know. So Harvard that year gave me exactly what I needed. They gave me love and a roof and some money to work. So the first challenge was to get access to the records, because when Heller broke the story, there was a period of about a week or two in which the Public Health Service people were pointing in opposite directions, saying, well, he did it, she did it, somebody else did it, and like this, but nobody really did it. And they were shocked. They were shocked to find out that it was still going on. So there was also a notice that the Justice Department had asked the National Archives to find material on this experiment and to sequester the material and to surrender it to the Justice Department against their investigation of what had happened. This was Richard Milhouse Nixon's Justice Department, and to be blunt, I didn't trust them. My fear was that if the Justice Department got the records, they would deep six them. There would be no justice for the people in the Tuskegee experiment, and that everything would just be swept under the rug. So by an outrageous coincidence of good luck, the Deputy Archivist of the United States, Albert Leisinger Jr., the number 2 guy, he would have been the number 1 guy, but he was an old socialist, and his politics were bad. So, you know, there was a pretty guy who ran the ship, and there was the guy who ran the place. And Al was the person who was the hands-on archivist. I called Al and said, you know, I found those records several years ago. I'd like to come and work in them before you get this stuff over. And he said, we can't find them. He said, since you worked here, all that material has been moved from the National Records, or from the National Archives on Pennsylvania Avenue to Suitland, Maryland, to the National Records Center. And if any of you have done archival work there, have you seen Raiders of the Lost Ark? You know, that cavernous building where the Ark disappears? Okay, that's Suitland, Maryland. I mean, you cannot imagine how big this place is and how stuff could disappear. You could lose a Volkswagen backfiring and you'd never find it. So Al reminded me that he was under orders from the Justice Department to find those materials and to surrender them. And nowhere in that was Jim Jones can come look at them. So he said, let me think about it. And a couple of hours later, I got a call from him. He said, come on down, get here as soon as you can. He said, the fix is in. All those guys out at Suitland, Maryland, they're all my pups. I trained them all. He said, you come, they're going to shoot you under the radar, let you go back in the stacks, and if you find the material, they're going to copy them for you at government expense. They're going to stamp them with the seal of the archive, the letter, you know, the record group, the box, the folder number, so it will all be admissible in a court of law. So if the Justice Department later says they can't find this stuff or disposes of it, you'll have a shadow copy, and that will be admissible in a court of law. And I tell that story because you're going to see why it becomes important at the end, okay? So I go to D.C., I stay in Mrs. Snyder's boarding house on Capitol Hill, $3 a night, how can you beat it? No extra charge for the cockroaches, you know, they're free. And it takes about a week and a half for me to figure out the pattern of the shipwreck. When a ship goes, you know, breaks apart, it's spreads stuff across the bottom. Well, this record group got really messed up when they transported it. And some of the boxes were over here and some of the boxes were somewhere else, but I finally figured out the pattern of the misshelving. So once I figured it out, I got the stuff together very quickly, and I had it copied as he, you know, as I said I would, or he advised me to, and that was the beginning of the research. I tell this story, Albert Leisinger Jr. is long dead, but I never could have written my book without him. He was a stand-up guy. He was a friend of every scholar who walked into the archives. His overriding passion was that the public has a right to know. And because of public servants like Al, scholars can do their jobs. Okay, he was a prince. Okay, let me start now. Okay, we're going to start with this guy. When I went to work on Tuskegee, before I took a note card, before I knew anything about it, I had a preconceived notion of what I'd find. It was a simple morality play. I was going to find mean-spirited doctors with blood dripping from their fangs. I was going to find helpless African-American sharecroppers who were fooled. I was going to find not really good intent, but just something pretty terrible. The problem with research is that it gets in the way of preconceived notions, and it makes you readjust your thinking and maybe see more complexity. What I discovered when I conceptualized the book, I think what I wanted to do was really use Tuskegee as a case study of race in medicine. I wanted to see what difference racial attitudes made in the perception that white physicians had of disease in African Americans, and then I wanted to see what difference that perception made. How powerful a prism was race? What got refracted when it went through it? So I started with the disease, and I started with the race. I started with syphilis and black people. And my methodology was pretty simple. I grabbed everything I could. I used the National Library of Medicine, the Countway Library at Harvard, every place I could use interlibrary loan for, and I got pretty close to getting all of the local, state, regional, and national medical journals that had any articles dealing with African Americans and syphilis. And that took me way back into the pre-Civil War period. And what I found when I read that literature, and that's chapter 2 in the book, the chapter title is A Notoriously Syphilis-Soaked Race. That's a direct quote from a document, from a medical article. What you see in that literature is that white doctors writing about syphilis in black patients cannot keep race out of the equation. What they say to the person is that African Americans have such strong libidos that they can't possibly control them. They are so galactically stupid that they won't come in for treatment. And therefore, we're looking at a disease that is both endemic and epidemic in this population and can never be better. And it can't be better because you can't cure, quote, these people, end quote. So I'm in business. There's the blood dripping or dripping from the fangs. I don't have to change my script. Except that literature or that argument goes forward from the 1840s. It goes way past 1900. 1900 is roughly the nadir of race relations in the United States. It's when Jim Crow came down so hard. It's when the marginalization of African Americans and discrimination against them was probably the worst in American history. If you look at the number of lynchings, if you look at the per capita income, if you look at the educational opportunities, African Americans are getting just really, really badly treated. So I'm thinking, okay, this is where it comes from, but it doesn't. The progressive era in American society, roughly 1890 to 1920, is a remarkable period of reform. The United States in the last third of the 19th century goes through this furious period of nation building. And the nation changes. It's no longer Jefferson's agricultural society. It looks a lot more like a play on Hamilton, on Broadway now called Hamilton's Vision of the Future. It's commerce, it's industry, it's industrialization, it's urbanization, it's immigration. And those big three, industrialization, urbanization, immigration, change America profoundly. Around 1900, people put on the brakes a little and start looking at this period of furious transformation. And they think, okay, well, maybe capitalism has made some excesses. Maybe we ought to have, child labor laws. Maybe it wouldn't be a bad idea to, let women vote. No, you can just tick them off. There's a reform after reform after reform that takes place when they're trying to, in effect, tame capitalism. And as part of that reform, race relations begins to come to the fore in American discussion. Booker T. Washington becomes the spokesperson for many African Americans. The Urban League is formed. The NAACP is formed. You have pushback against lynch law, and you have, within the medical profession, a sea change in attitudes. The germ theory of disease, which that elegant, wonderful, blockbuster idea of the late 19th century, or the last third of the 19th century, the germ theory of disease is a powerful incentive for action, because what doctors do not want to say is that any group lies beyond the pale. They don't want to say that, we can cure white people, but we can't cure black people. The power of this idea is that science is a bad dude, and it can take on all comers. And if we put enough resources into health, then we've got something special about to happen. So where you get the money to start doing something about African American health is, first of all, from the Rockefeller Foundation. The Rockefeller Foundation, is rich beyond the dreams of avarice. They have nothing but money to work with. And they start a hookworm campaign. They start a pellagra campaign. They do wonderful public health work. And in short order, they demonstrate to state health departments and to the United States Public Health Service, with whom they partner, that you can do a lot if you stop blaming victims. If you just put some resources in and, use techniques of epidemiology, you can get patients in, you can get them treated. So what happens is Rockefeller kind of stakes out several diseases, and it's a disease model, but the Public Health Service also wants to get into the act. And the way they get into the act is with money. It's not Rockefeller money, it's Julius Rosenwald money. Julius Rosenwald, who was one of the founders of Sears and Roebuck, makes his fortune there, falls under the influence of Booker T. Washington. And for the most part, Rosenwald puts his money into building schools. He goes into the rural South, where it's supposed to be separate but equal schools. He finds there are no schools in many communities for black children. So he builds these little red brick schoolhouse and starts to bankroll teachers. And it's a goad, really. It's a challenge to the states to do the right thing by black citizens. Well, as part of that Rosenwald initiative, he gets interested in public health because Booker T. Washington, who started something called National Negro Health Week, also tells him, we can't send a child to school who's ill. You can't expect a sick kid to do well with books. So, okay, Rosenwald says, well, maybe I can put some money into health problems. He doesn't know anything about health in the South, African American health. So he hires a guy named Michael M. Davis. Michael M. Davis is a white guy he's got a PhD from Columbia in anthropology, but he's really a medical sociologist. And he's responsible for the dispensary movement, in Boston, bringing low-cost health care to blue-collar folks, Irish for the most part. But what he does, Rosenwald hires Michael M. Davis to create a medical division within his foundation, modeled after the Rockefeller Foundation's medical division. Because Davis doesn't know squat about black health, he turns to the United States Public Health Service and says, loan me an officer who knows something about black health issues. The person selected, Cummins, who's the Surgeon General, appoints this guy, Tolliver Clark. Tolliver Clark happens to be the director of the Division of Venereal Diseases of the Public Health Service. Now, if you look at the Public Health Service at this time, we're talking circa 1925 to 30, it's really organized on the disease model. You got people doing TB, you got people doing, different diseases. And if you talk with those people, they will tell you to the person that the disease they work on is the most important. There's no other one that can compete. They have enormous esprit de corps within their divisions. Tolliver Clark's no exception. He says, the most important disease you can possibly ever work on is syphilis, because syphilis is a major health issue for African Americans. It's an issue that the medical profession has all but given up on. And if we can show them, if we can demonstrate that we can cure patients, then we will have gone a long way toward, one, breaking the back of racial medicine, these assumptions that you can't do anything with black patients, and two, addressing a really important public health issue. So that's what happens. Tolliver Clark sells Rosenwald on syphilis. The way they attack it is they choose 6 different southern communities, chosen on the basis of each of those communities presenting a different demographic profile of the conditions under which blacks live. At one end of the continuum is Albemarle County, Virginia, the home of the University of Virginia, which happens to have a really good free public clinic. At the other end is Macon County, Alabama, and Macon County, Alabama is miserably poor. It is just, think of a rural slum and that's what you got, okay? It's destitute. They go in with a Wasserman dragnet, they test a representative sample, okay, of the black population. They find out who has syphilis. Excuse me. They put together mobile clinics to treat the patients with the drugs of choice, which at this point are arspetamine, neo-arspetamine, and mercury by inunction. And after about a year, they publish their papers. And what they say in the papers is that syphilis, like most diseases, is heavily linked to socioeconomic conditions. In Albemarle County, they found a syphilis rate of 7%, okay, in the population they tested. In Macon County, Alabama, they found a whopping 35% rate of infection. But in that 35%, case histories showed that 62%, more than half of them, had congenital syphilis. So the disease had, largely lost its venereal quality and had become one of many endemic diseases in that community. You could have, found tuberculosis, you could have found pellagra, you could have found just about anything, because what they found in Macon County, Alabama, despite the fact that the Tuskegee Institute was there with a hospital, what they found was the poorest patients who had no medical care. They went from cradle to grave, never saw a physician. Okay. So they write up these articles, and they're drum beating articles. You read them, and they're cheerful. They say we can do something about syphilis. At this point, it's 1931. Excuse me. The stock market has collapsed. The money for those syphilis control demonstrations, the treatment programs, came from the sale of Sears and Roebuck stock. And so with the collapse of the stock market, that money dried up, and the Rosenwald Fund decides to pull out. They say it was great, we had a good experience, we've shown the southern state legislatures what you can do if you put some resources in. They've got to carry the ball. Tolliver Clark, excuse me, I've got a frog in my throat. Excuse me. Tolliver Clark doesn't want to stop. He wants to study untreated syphilis. And the reason he wants to study untreated syphilis is that one of the main points you read when you read the literature, textbook and article literature on syphilis in blacks, excuse me, is the notion that it is a fundamentally different disease in black people compared to white people. And the difference that they posit is that in black people, it's more likely to have a high incidence of cardiovascular syphilis, and in white people, it's more likely to have a high incidence of neurosyphilis. And that's an interesting idea. an interesting concept, and I tried to run it down in the medical literature, and I think I ran it to ground. There was a guy in 1874 named Taylor who wrote about that, and no one challenged it. They just assumed it was right. So, and his was crude reductionism, by the way. He said, you know, blacks are big, strong field hands. They have bigger hearts, bigger targets, you know, so that's why they get more cardiovascular syphilis. Well, excuse me. Clark wants to go back in to Alabama, and he wants to study untreated syphilis to see if that is true, if there is more cardiovascular syphilis. There was a study in Scandinavia, the Oslo study, in which they had studied untreated syphilis in whites, and that was in the 1890s and the early 1900s. That study did show a high incidence of neural syphilis and tertiary syphilis in the third stage of syphilis. But what's interesting about the Oslo study is that when Paul Ehrlich discovered salvarsan, they gave it to him, and they stopped the experiment, and they made it a retrospective study. So I don't like comparisons with Oslo and Tuskegee because they're not comparable. When there's a good treatment, the Scandinavians get it. That's not going to happen here. So Clark decides that he will study untreated syphilis in Macon County, Alabama. But he's only going to study it for 1 year, okay? He doesn't think about a longitudinal study. Let me advance this. I want to spend just a second. I am extremely fortunate to have photographs of Macon County, Alabama from 1932. This is the year the experiment begins, and these photographs are period pieces. That shows cotton culture, the cotton growing right up to the shotgun shack. No gardens, you know, just, there you go. These are sharecroppers, some of whom were in the experiment. It's hard to tell who's more emaciated, you know, the mule or the man. Okay. All right. So Tolliver Clark sends his two best lieutenants, O.C. Winger, Oliver Clarence Winger, and this guy, Raymond Bondelier, down to Tuskegee to put together what becomes the Tuskegee Study. Now, how do they do it? They first of all go to the black community and they lie fluently. They tell them that this is going to be a continuation of the Rosenwald Fund treatment program. They don't tell them that they're not going to treat them, okay? They get the black leaders on board, the church, the ministers, the local opinion elites, and then they go to the Tuskegee Institute and get them to agree to let them use the facilities there for the experiment. Excuse me. Excuse me.
You need some Burt's Bees.
Actually, I think what I need, if you guys will give me just 1 second, thank you. I'm going to also shoot up. I have asthma, and I think I'm getting a little.
Okay.
Excuse me. Yeah. Okay. They go to the Tuskegee Institute to Robert Russa Moten, who is Booker T. Washington's successor as principal, and they get him to agree to let the Public Health Service use the Andrew Hospital on the campus there to conduct examinations of the men. They do not lie to Tuskegee. They tell Tuskegee the truth. So from the beginning, the Tuskegee Study, and this is what kind of messes up the simple morality play, the Tuskegee Study has biracial support. Black educators and physicians who know what's going on agree to cooperate with it. So it's not one group solely against another. It's messier than that, more complicated, more like life. They start to examine the men. They go into the hinterland, and they round these people up. Let me introduce you to a key figure. Well, Eugene Dibble is the head of the Andrew Hospital, and he's one of the black physicians who cooperates with the Tuskegee Study. Here's the linchpin person in terms of clinical contact. This is Eunice Rivers, Nurse Rivers. She was the liaison, okay, between the subjects in the experiment and the doctors. And her job was to keep the men interested, to get their cooperation, and above all, to make them think that the Public Health Service was doing them good. So you can look at her as a Judas goat. You can look at her as a perhaps more complicated figure, and I'll return to that in a moment. But without her, this experiment could not have gone forward. Before I met her, by the way, I chased this woman for years, trying to get her to give me an interview. And finally, after the out-of-court settlement for the study, which I'll get to in a few minutes, she agreed to spend time with me. So I spent the better part of 4 days with her, driving around Macon County to all the places where they would gather the men up, places you've never heard of. And before I met her, I had a good image of her in my mind. She was Big Nurse from One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, Nurse Ratched. Once again, reality gets in the way of preconceived notions. She's a much more interesting character. But anyway, she's the person who talks with the men, keeps them interested. When the government doctors want to see them, she drives out and gets them. She brings them back to Tuskegee. She's the linchpin figure, really, Eunice Rivers. So Tolliver Clark reads these reports from Raymond Vondelier and from O.C. Winger, and they write back after they start examining the men. Oh, hold on, let me back up and pick up a stitch. The popular notion of Tuskegee is that the men received no treatment whatsoever, okay, and that's not right. The state health officer, a man named Dr. Baker, and he was chief health officer in Alabama, demanded that the Public Health Service give the people in Tuskegee some treatment. He said, you're not going to come in here on my watch and examine these people for a bad disease and not try to help them. And so Clark is really, pissed off about that. He does not want to give the treatment, but he understands that he's got to do it to get what he wants done. So all the subjects in Tuskegee, and eventually there'll be 421 of them, all of the who have syphilis and then 200 controls, all of the subjects receive some treatment, usually a few shots of neo-arsphetamin, and excuse me, a second, and a few applications of mercury by inunction. Now, if you know the treatment schedules for syphilis in the pre-penicillin days, you really have to keep patients under treatment for sometimes a year and a half with a regular schedule of treatment. And it takes a good clinician to gauge the toxicity of the treatment and the patient's resistance and how they're doing with these very powerful drugs. And you have to adjust it to the patient's tolerance. But you do get negative serologies. You can kill spirochetes with this treatment. And I'm pounding on that because I don't like the people who tell me that, well, when this experiment starts, there's no good treatment at all. And that's not true. There was the treatment of the day, and it worked if you applied it with skill and long enough. Okay, so all the men in the experiment get some treatment. Excuse me, not enough to cure them, not nearly enough to cure them, but enough to make the experiment hopelessly contaminated. Okay, one little bit of treatment, that's it. You no longer have an untreated group. So as a study of undertreated syphilis, there'd be something to talk about. Okay, as a study of untreated syphilis, it is totally bogus. So it is, from the outset, bad science. When you read the literature, there will be 14 major articles published on the Tuskegee study, And every one of those articles will begin with the preamble that this is a study of untreated syphilis in the Negro male in a rural community in Alabama. Okay? They don't own up to the fact that the men had received some treatment and that what they were doing had no scientific validity. So the guys who die in this experiment and are supposed to have died for the betterment of science, it doesn't work. It does not work. So anyway, Tolliver Clark reads the reports that Raymond Bondelier and O.C. Winger write, and Bondelier in particular is eloquent. He writes rhapsodic descriptions of cardiovascular syphilis. It is he who turns the phrase a perfect gold mine of cardiovascular syphilis, which is, again, one of my chapter titles. I always use direct quotes for chapter titles. I try to capture the chapter with the title. And he's writing back to Clark saying, let's don't end the experiment. My gosh, we can learn so much if we just keep it going. And Clark pulls the plug because the Rosenwald Fund is not helping. He doesn't have the resources. 1 year is going to do it. And so he calls the boys home. And the experiment would have ended then in 1933, except for one fact. Tolliver Clark retired. He was an old man. And guess who replaced him as the director of the Division of Venereal Diseases of the U.S. Public Health Service? Raymond Bondelier. Now, I'm kind of pushing this point for a very simple reason. People ask me, how does the Tuskegee Study go on for 40 years? It starts in 1932. It doesn't end until 1972. Count them. That's 4 decades. How did that happen? A large part of the explanation is that the Public Health Service promotes from within. There's a career ladder. And young officers who start off as past assistant, a surgeon, surgeon generals, climb the ladder. And they go on, oops, I seem to have done more than I wanted to. I'll get back to it. All right, here. So once Raymond Bondelier assumes the helm of the division, the Public Health Service is going to go forward with the Tuskegee Study, there's no doubt. He believes it's an important scientific study. He has no intention of pulling the plug on it. He controls the division budget. So from there forward, its future is secure. Now, this anticipates a bureaucratic pattern. Over the next 40 years, time and time again, a person who had started on Tuskegee as a young clinician will get promoted and will later be the director of the division. And time again, when that person becomes the director of the division, he'll pull out the drawer, he'll look at the articles published on Tuskegee, and he'll say, oh yeah, Tuskegee, Jesus, I worked there in 1937, I remember that. Great science, great program. No way we should end it. The Tuskegee Study never has an opportunity to be looked at through fresh eyes. The people who review it, who determine its future, they are all co-opted by familiarity. They know about it, they've worked on it as young clinicians, and they think it's great. So I don't have to look much further than that to explain to myself as a scholar why it goes on for 40 years. Except for, we could also talk about inertia. The body in motion, remaining in motion, unless acted upon by an outside force, okay, and there's no outside force. So it can go forward of its own momentum. The Tuskegee Study is really easy to run, okay? It's dirt simple, not expensive. Nurse Rivers is the point person. She stays on site. Once a year, the government doctors come back from DC and they conduct, their language, not mine, annual roundups, okay? Nurse Rivers drives the men into the Andrews Hospital. They are examined, okay, and, well, here, let me show you some stuff. No, I'll show you some stuff in a minute. They're examined. Their Careful case notes are taken on each of the subjects. They are then driven home, and that's it. Nothing else has to happen until they die. And Nurse Rivers has this wonderful rapport with the families of these men, so that anytime they're ill, and certainly anytime they're critically ill or looking like they might be an extremis, she is there like a hovering angel, holding the hand of the man, getting him into the Andrew Hospital, getting him to die there so they can perform autopsies. So the autopsies can confirm the clinical diagnoses that they're making about the complications of the disease. So that's it. There's one annual roundup a year. Nurse Rivers takes care of everything else. That's the way it goes for 40 years. Nothing really interferes. Now, I like to envision a different Tuskegee than the one that had happened, and an opportunity for morality to get back into this discussion, for them to see that something's wrong with leaving men who have syphilis undertreated and watching them die, because more than 100 of the 400 are going to die of complications of syphilis during the life of this experiment. So the first thing I'd like to think of is the year 1937. The study starts in 32. By the way, that photograph gives you a wonderful snapshot of the biracial composition of the people who work on Tuskegee, all right? The gentleman in the center there is Jerome Peters. He's a pathologist, okay, at the Veterans Hospital in Tuskegee. It's Nurse Rivers, and then the white doctors of the day. In 1937, there's a new Surgeon General of the United States, and he starts a rural syphilis control demonstration program that is modeled after the Rosenwald Fund demonstrations. He sends mobile clinics into the rural South. They do Wasserman dragnets. They ascertain incidence figures. They isolate the patients who are positive serologies. They treat those people with rapid schedule Salverson treatment, and they put a big bang against a very serious disease. Representatives of that program, workers in the program, made it to Tuskegee in the fall of 1937. And the men in the rural communities lined up to be tested. And Nurse Rivers would go to those meeting places and say, don't treat that man, don't treat that man, don't treat that man. They're in the Tuskegee Study. They're not to be treated. So they were pulled out of the lines and they were not given treatment they would have gotten otherwise. Now, this to me ups the moral ante. One can argue that until 1937, the men were in no real danger of being treated. Poverty and ignorance had dictated that they would not be treated. But in 1937, that changes dramatically. Because as of 1937, those men would have been treated and they were actively denied treatment. Okay, that's the first thing. First lost opportunity. Second lost opportunity, 1941. Pearl Harbor, World War II. About a third of the men are old or young enough, to be inducted into the armed services. They are not inducted because the Surgeon General wrote letters to the local draft boards in Macon County, Russell County, Pollock County, Tallapoosa County, all the contiguous counties, Bullock County, and said, here's a list of men in the study. Do not, under any circumstances, draft them. If you draft them, as part of their induction, they'll be tested, and if they have syphilis, they'll be treated. Well, we don't want them treated. These people are serving their country. They are, his phrase, soldiers of science. They're doing yeoman duty now for the country by being in this experiment. Don't treat them. That's the second time. Okay, something could have changed, and it didn't. 1943, something called the Henderson Act in Alabama, state law. It is a model public health law that requires the treatment of medically indigent patients who have a communicable disease It requires treatment at state expense. Once again, the men would have been treated under the auspices of this act, but they're denied treatment because the lists are still circulated. They were not going to get treatment. By the way, when I say list circulated, let me just fill in some of the grammar. The Public Health Service convened the medical society in Macon County. It convened the medical societies in all the contiguous counties I just mentioned, and they gave lists of the subjects in the experiment, saying if, perchance, one of these people come to you for treatment, don't treat them because you're going to screw up our study. These people are to remain untreated. So let's think about that for a second. Let's think about a group being hermetically sealed, cut off from every avenue, shut away, pushed down from any hope of treatment. Because that's what we're talking about. That's what happened. The next thing the Henderson Act doesn't matter. The next thing I like to think about is penicillin. Okay, penicillin is a game changer in one sense because it works so quickly and so well. It's not the long, prolonged treatment that salvarsan or mercury by induction. I mean, it's the magic bullet. And when, oops, I got to get this going again. Where is it? There. Come on, come back, come back. All right, don't come back. Be that way. Penicillin is developed. It's scarce in World War II. It's used for combat for troops, but it's available pretty widely after the war, pretty quickly. The person who was the head of the Division of Venereal Diseases, on whose watch penicillin was developed, I was going to show you a photograph of him, but it's gone south on me, was John R. Heller. Does John R. Heller's name make a bell to any of you? Rod Heller, John R. Heller? Anybody? Well, something that tickles me is people say, well, Tuskegee, these, okay, sure it happened, but these people are nobodies. Who's ever heard of them? John R. Heller put together the control group in Tuskegee in 1933, the year after it started. And then he got promoted through the division and became division director. Okay, in 1948, he's the first director of the National Cancer Institute. It's that John R. Heller. And in 1965, he becomes the head of Sloan Kettering, just to get it closer to home. So it's that John R. Heller. And I can do it with other people in the study. Some of them go on to have very distinguished careers, and they're still into Tuskegee up to their necks. Well, Heller, when I interviewed him, I asked him about penicillin. And, the interview was going pretty well for a while, and then I asked him about penicillin. I said, well, did you guys ever think about giving guys penicillin? He said, no. I said, well, at the risk of belaboring the obvious, why not? He said, well, it would have ended the experiment. I said, okay, I got it. End of discussion. But I also had a chance to ask him another question that got me thrown out of his office. Because the next time I like to think about an opportunity to rethink Tuskegee, that has to do with Nuremberg. I wondered if the people involved in Tuskegee ever thought about it critically in the light of the Nuremberg trials of the medical, the Nazi doctors, the Nuremberg Code that's articulated that is supposed to point us in a different and better direction. So at the end of my interview, by stealth, I'm trying to sneak up on him, and I come to Nuremberg. I said, Dr. Heller, did you guys ever talk about the Tuskegee experiment with regard, any juxtaposition going on there in your minds about Nuremberg and Tuskegee? What about it? And there's a long pause, and I'm waiting because I know not to interrupt when a guy's pausing. Then the light bulb goes off over his head. He says, are you inferring that I'm a Nazi? No. Are you calling me a Nazi? He gets really huffy. And I said, no, Dr. Heller, I just want to know whether you guys discussed this. And he throws me out. The interview's over. And I walked out of the interview, kind of halfway smiling, because I thought, well, if I don't ask questions and get thrown out, maybe I'm not doing my job. And then I thought afterward, that's prideful and, you're full of shit. I should have, I should have found some way to hang in there, and get him to talk to me. So it was a failure as a oral historian. But anyway, that's the next time I like to think about it, that nothing happened. The final time that I think they have a chance and nothing comes down is the civil rights movement. Macon County, Alabama is 35 miles from Montgomery, Alabama. And Montgomery, Alabama in 1954 becomes the epicenter of the civil rights movement. And oh good, because I'd like to show you some pictures. The civil rights movement is the largest people's uprising, since the American Revolution. And it's not white folks who are doing it, it's black folks. They're out there in the streets, they're demanding equal rights under the law, and they're paying a horrible price in terms of violence, but they're relentless. And it starts with, good, thank you very much, because I'll just do this very quickly. All right, this is the biracial support. This is one of the stations where they go out to the hinterland and, they do the serologies. There's Nurse Rivers, that wonderful smile. They're getting ready to do a venipuncture, draw blood. The men think they are being treated, by the way. Nurse Rivers gives them aspirin and iron tonic, and she dispenses that every time she sees the men, and they think that's powerful medicine. And for people who don't have any other medicine, aspirin in particular is a powerful medicine. It helps with aches and pains. So they always say, I'm under the care of Nurse Rivers, I'm getting treatment from the government doctors. She's getting pink medicine. This guy thought that spirochetes got encased, in the tissue in the eye, so he's paying close attention there. They're always interested in X-ray and, tests for EKGs for cardiovascular, heart, anything dealing with the heart. This is one of the spinal taps. They did those. They called it Dr. Bondelier's golden needle treatment. That's a 20-gauge needle. The way they lied to the men, they didn't tell them what they were going to do. They didn't let them talk to each other afterward. A lot of them got horrible headaches and were just, really messed up. I don't show you the worst photographs, but this is ulcerated cutaneous syphilis, okay? And this is what we're talking about, that's being left untreated. I withheld some of the nastier ones. Okay, when I say that it was never sub rosa, that there were published articles, there are 14 of these. They're published in leading medical journals. They go year after year. They just keep going. This is the guy that throws me out of his office, Rod Heller. Roderick, oops, oh, come on. There's a gremlin in here. I'm touching something that I think, thank you, yes, stay around. You're doing all the good. This is a wonderful example of their paternalistic crap. On the 25th anniversary, they give them this certificate, they give the men this certificate, and they give them $25, $1 for each year participation. So, oops, I did it again.
I don't know what's happening, but if you hit escape, it'll come back.
Escape does it? Okay.
Escape will do it.
Okay, thank you. I don't either. Okay, I'll get to this in a second. All right, the person I want on the screen now is this individual right here, Peter Buxton. Okay, everything that I've described doesn't change from 1932 until 1972, until this man enters the picture. He's the whistleblower, all right? He works at the Hunt Street Clinic in Alabama, in San Francisco. He is a social worker who does epidemiological follow-up work. His job is to find out who sexual partners are, get them in for treatment, etc. He works on a paper, okay, for a graduate course, and he comes across stuff on Tuskegee. And so he gathers all these published articles, and at this point there are 12 of them, and he reads them, and his jaw falls open. He said, I can't believe this, what's happening? So he goes to his superior in the Public Health Service and questions the Tuskegee Study, and the guy tells him to shut up. And Peter doesn't shut up. He's indefatigable. He's a pain in the ass. He keeps going back and back. So then he goes over the head and he starts writing people at CDC. And he writes the directors at CDC and says, you know, this Tuskegee study, I don't know about it. I think it's awful. And I think we've got a moral problem here. So what they do is they fly him out in 1969 at government expense. They get him in a big room, the director of CDC's conference room, I've been in it. And there are about a dozen public health service officers, all of whom have worked at some capacity or another on Tuskegee, in the room, and they beat the socks off him. You know, they tell him, you're not a physician. You don't divine the mysteries of science, buddy. You know, you're a well-intentioned, good-hearted person who just doesn't get it. So we understand your compassion, we understand everything that you've said, but shut up, sit down, and don't get in the way of good science. So, you know, they rough him up. Well, Peter goes home, and, you know, he licks his wounds for a couple of weeks, and then Peter, being Peter, ego rallies. And he comes back and he writes this incredible letter. And he says, you know, you're right. I'm not a doc. I may not be smart enough to understand science, but I know a moral issue when I see one. You have put in place a study that has systematically denied people treatment for a deadly disease. By your own admission in published articles, more than 100 of them have died. Now, I don't know whether a jury would talk murder 1, but they might talk murder 2. That got their attention. That letter threatening consequences of actions was enough to produce a review. In this review, which took place in 1969, the Public Health Service convened a blue ribbon panel to discuss the morality of the Tuskegee study. This is the first time this has ever happened. No person of color was on that committee. No bioethicist was on that committee. All the people who had worked on the committee had worked on Tuskegee, with the exception of one person. And the one person is Gene Stollerman, who was a professor at Vanderbilt, a distinguished syphilis in his own right. And Stollerman is the one guy who raises his hand and says, I've got a moral problem with this. I don't think it's right. And they argue him down. Okay. So now it's 1969. They've reviewed it, and they decide that the best way to handle Tuskegee is to put more resources into it. No, I'm serious. You know, there's this wonderful letter in which they say, you know, we've gotten a little sloppy with the numbers. We need to kind of spiff up the statistical analysis of our data. We owe it to the men who have died to see the experiment to conclusion. An end point is when the last patient dies. Not that we owe them treatment. We owe them the best science we can make of the study. So that's where things are standing when Peter Buxton comes back into the picture. 3 years later, 1972, by this time Peter has left the Public Health Service. He's gone to law school. He tries to interest one of his law professors in this study, a guy who is a bigwig in torts. The guy tells him, Prosser is his name, by the way. Prosser tells him, harumph, young man, stirring up litigation? Why, the statute of limitations has long since run out. You have evidentiary problems. How are you going to exhume bodies and say they died of syphilis when they may have died of something else? You'll have no standing in court. So he tells him to shut up. Peter, in 1972, is still, to my mind, you know, he's Diogenes. He's the honest man. You know, he's stopping one of three. He's telling his story. And this time he tells it to a woman whose name is Edith Lederer. And Edie is a reporter. Actually, she's in charge of the AP's Far Eastern desk. And she's in San Francisco for some R&R. And she and Peter have a date. And Peter tells her about the study, and she can't believe it. So they go back to his house. They order in Chinese food. They're sitting on his, the rug. She's reading the articles that he's feeding her, and she says, oh, my God. So she calls her boss at the AP and says, have I got a story? And her boss says, no, you don't have a story. You're going back to Japan, lady. You know, you're on the Far Eastern desk. Gene Heller of the Associated Press, whose name I mentioned at the beginning, I think, has the story, so they gave it to Gene. Gene, in 1972, in the summer, started making phone calls. And she goes to the medical libraries, and she reads the articles, and she calls CDC, and how many people died, and she gets matter-of-fact answers. Then she publishes, in rapid succession, 4 very hard-hitting expose articles. And in the wake of those articles, the experiment comes down like a house of cards. The Public Health Service at first tries to defend it lamely. Then that pointing that I talked about earlier, no, he did it, she did it, we don't know who did it. It all falls in place, and the experiment ends. But what happens next? What happens next involves this man, Fred Gray. Anybody know Fred? His name ring a bell? Okay, there you go. All right. Fred was in a very strategic place at a very strategic time. 1954, Montgomery, Alabama, the NAACP has one staff attorney in Montgomery, Alabama. It's Fred Gray. He's a young, freshly minted lawyer from Case, and he's at the right place. So he represents Rosa Parks. When Martin Luther King the next year does the Montgomery bus boycott, he's his lawyer. Fred is a remarkable man. I would rather have a bear after me than Fred Gray. I mean it. A bear might decide to eat somebody else. He might lose attention. He might stray off and kill a deer or something. But if Fred gets after you, he's going to eat you. And he's going to chew you up and swallow you in very small pieces. He is a ordained Church of Christ minister who has all the quiet confidence of a Christian holding 4 aces. He is one of the first black legislators since Reconstruction in the state. He made a deal with his God, okay, when he served in the service before he went to law school, and he's a race man. The deal he made with his God was that he was going to come back from Korea, and he was going to kill everything that had segregation written on it. He was going to just destroy everything that had segregation written on it if God would give him the strength. And he never looked to the left and the right. This guy has made case law that is just unbelievably good. He has had 11 cases before the United States Supreme Court. He is a force of nature. All right, Fred brings the lawsuit on behalf of the survivors of the Tuskegee Study and the estates of those who don't survive. He filed in Alabama in Frank Johnson's court. You couldn't get a better jurist in the South at that time, a great friend of civil rights. And Johnson was about to throw him out of court because every time Fred asked the Justice Department in discovery for records, the Justice Department answered, unable to locate. We can't find those records. They don't exist. So I'm following the case then. I'm working on Bad Blood, and I'm following the case in the New York Times. And I see that this back and forth is going in court. I called Fred and said, I'm Jim Jones. I'm a historian. I'm working on it, and I've got records. The next morning, he knocked on my door, and I'll never forget the encounter because I had 4 letter boxes on my dining room table with a bowl of fruit. And Fred and I say hello at the door. He blows right by me. He runs right to those boxes. He's getting out folders, and he reaches over with his left hand, gets a banana, peels it, and starts eating. And I thought, we're going to get along. This person does not have an affected bone in his body. We're going to get along. So long story short, Fred now had some good traction. And he used the documents that I gave him to go back to Frank Johnson. and say, look, if there are this many records on the beginning of the experiment, and all I had was the first 6 years of it, I didn't have anything else at that point. But if there are this many records for the first 6 years, the nature of bureaucracy is that the paper grows, it doesn't shrink. So there's got to be more stuff. And so Frank Johnson gave him a court order telling CDC to open its files and let us conduct the search to see if we could find the documents. Fred asked me to join him as his, gopher, as his archival guy who can suck dust, and I can do that. So Fred, pulling the levers and getting us in. I was joined by Harold Edgar at Columbia. Harold had done a lot of. He's a professor at Columbia. Used to be, I think, associate dean of the law school. He had done a lot of pro bono work for the NAACP, so he was helping Fred with the legal strategy for the case, but he and I also did some of the archival stuff together. Long story short, where no documents are supposed to exist, we come out with 6 5-drawer filing cabinets, drawers of documents on the Tuskegee study. All right, Fred has the goods now. The government doesn't want to try this case. If you know lawyer lingo, there's something called bad facts. And bad facts mean that you're not holding the cards. You have a case that put before a jury, you're very probably going to lose it. So the government settles out of court. They give some money, not much, to the subjects in the experiment. They give everybody in the experiment lifetime, medical care for any ailment of any kind. They're Americans who actually have great health insurance, but they paid for it with a very dear price. So the upshot of Tuskegee is that the men are treated, they get a cash settlement, their estates get some money, and it could have ended there, except it didn't. Tuskegee has legs. It keeps popping up. It keeps walking around. You see it come back really with policy payoff. The Human Subjects Act, is really called into existence in reaction to Tuskegee. The fact that there are IRBs